Bread of Life Devotionals. Welcome to our weekly devotional. Today we continue with our study through the book of Romans, and today we look at chapter 11. I know many of you are smartphone owners and users, and I remember my very first smartphone. It was this small Samsung phone. But after a while, the phone shut down and I couldn't restart it. For some reason, it just couldn't restart. And I tried all the tricks I knew, removing the battery, trying to restart it, but it couldn't get restarted. And so I knew that phone was beyond repair because I'd been with it for a while. When Paul introduces to us this chapter, he begins with a question and he asks, is it then that all Israel has been cast away, or has all Israel been rejected by God? Because in the previous chapters, in chapter 10 and in chapter 9, we see his burden and his earnest desire to see Israel turning to the Lord. And every time he pleads, he says it is hard, and he mentions that in these two chapters that he desires to see Israel turning to the Lord from their unbelief. And so as he gets to chapter 11, because people might think that all hope was gone for Israel, and so when he asks that question, then is all Israel, cast away? Are they rejected by God? And Paul answers that question and says, certainly not. And he gives, two examples. First of all, he makes reference to himself. And Paul says that he is a Jew, he is a seed of Abraham, and he is also a believer. And so he himself is a remnant. And also Paul talks about the example of Elijah after he had confronted the prophets of Baal. And when he had run away from the threat by Jezebel, Elijah wanted to die. And so when God confronted Elijah, Elijah said that, God, I'm the only one who's remained, who's true to you, because all Israel has turned away to idolatry. And God tells him that there are 7,000 men that have not bowed down to Baal. And so Paul here in this chapter tells us that even though it seems as if all Israel is lost in unbelief and have not embraced the righteousness that comes through faith, even though that a majority of them were still insisting on the observance of the law and the righteousness that is attained by works, Paul tells us that there is a remnant of Israel that has not continued in unbelief, but there's a remnant that has followed Jesus Christ. And that for us would be our main reflection today. Sometimes when we look at people, sometimes when we look at situations that look beyond us, beyond our wisdom, beyond our experience, beyond our knowledge and our education and any resource that we can think of that we have or ability as human beings, sometimes we tend to give up. Sometimes we tend to think that all is gone. But this particular chapter for me, as I reflected on it this morning and yesterday, one thing has continued, to be very clear, that all is not lost. Even though we may look at things in a limited perspective and think that everything, every hope is gone, it is not true. Because in the greater perspective and in the eyes of God, there is hope, there is room for God to do something new. And so Paul tells us in this chapter that if Israel does not continue in their unbelief, then they will be restored back to God. And Paul here gives us an illustration using an olive tree, a cultivated olive tree. And he says that the Jews were this cultivated olive tree. But when they continued in their unbelief and in their disobedience, God had to cut off some branches, and so he grafted in the Gentiles. And so God also used the disobedience of the Jews to create room for others who were not Jews, so that they could also be joined into the household of faith. And therefore God did not waste that experience, of the Jews in rejecting him, God now turned to the Gentile nations, to the non-Jews, and gave them an opportunity to hear the gospel and to turn to him. And so they are falling away. Paul argues this way, that their disobedience and their falling away, God used that to turn to the Gentiles and to draw the Gentiles to himself, and using that so that he could provoke the Jews to jealousy, and then they would turn back to God. And so he says that if they don't continue in their unbelief, then they have an opportunity to turn back to the Lord. And so that tells me that there is room for them to be saved. And so all is not gone, all hope is not gone. And that should encourage someone today who maybe looks at a member of their family or a friend or even your own life. Maybe you think that all hope is gone, and you look at yourself and you think you're at the end of it all, at the end of the rope, and there is nothing more that can be done. I want to tell you, unlike that phone of mine that could not be salvaged, you can still be salvaged. God is not done with you. And so there is hope for you. And that will be my word for us this week. May the Lord bless you. Thank you for taking time to join me for this week's devotionals. Bye-bye.